To and calm, unexpected standstill, but it wasn't a crash or road construction that halted vehicles that evening. It was something far more extraordinary and heart-stopping. A small chestnut Mustang, wild-eyed and determined, darted between the lanes of traffic, approaching cars with unusual boldness. The wild horse moved with purpose, as if searching for something or someone among the bewildered drivers. Soft, emotional music plays under the golden glow of a Montana sunset along the winding stretch of Pine Creek Road. Traffic who watched. In amazement, Officer Maya Delgado had been finishing her patrol shift when the call came in. After 12 years with the Pine Ridge County Sheriff's Department, she thought she'd seen everything these rural roads could offer. Lost hikers, wildlife encounters, the occasional escaped livestock. But the dispatcher's words caught her attention. Immediately, wild Mustang causing traffic disruption on Pine Creek Road, mile marker 37, appears to be attempting to interact with vehicles. Maya flipped on her lights and siren, navigating through the early evening traffic. The sun's final rays painted the distant mountains in shades of amber and gold as she approached the scene. She could see the line of stopped cars ahead. Hazard. Lights blinking in warning. As she pulled onto the shoulder and stepped out of her cruiser, she spotted the animal in question. A small female Mustang, probably no more than 3 years old, with a distinctive white blaze running down her face. "Keep your distance," Maya called to the onlookers who had emerged from their vehicles, smartphones raised to capture the unusual sight. Wild horses can be unpredictable. But something about this horse struck Maya as decidedly not unpredictable. The Mustang wasn't displaying typical signs of fear or aggression. Instead, it moved with what almost seemed like deliberation, approaching a vehicle, then backing away when the occupants weren't who she sought. The animal's behavior triggered something in Maya's memory, a training seminar she'd attended years. Go about animal behavior and intelligence. Maya approached slowly, one hand raised in a calming gesture. The Mustang's ears pricked forward, her dark eyes fixing on the officer's uniform. Then, to everyone's astonishment, the small horse trotted directly toward Maya, stopping just 10 feet away. The animal pawed at the ground, tossed her head, then turned and took several steps away, looking back as if expecting the officer to follow. "She wants you to go with her," called an elderly man from the sidelines, a weathered rancher who had pulled over when he spotted the commotion. "I've worked with horses my whole life. That little lady is trying to tell you something." Maya hesitated, keenly aware of the crowd watching and the potential danger. Wild Mustangs weren't typically aggressive toward humans, but they weren't known for seeking human assistance either. She radioed her position to dispatch, requesting animal control backup. "Be advised, I'm observing unusual behavior in this Mustang. She appears to be attempting to lead me somewhere. I'm going to maintain a safe distance and observe." The dispatcher's voice crackled back, concern evident. "Officer Delgado, please use extreme caution. Animal control is 20 minutes out." Maya nodded to herself, eyes never leaving the Mustang. "Copy that, I'll stay in radio contact." The horse neighed softly, taking a few more steps away from the road, then looking back at Maya with what she could only describe as impatience. Behind her, Maya could hear murmurs from the crowd of motorists. "I've never seen anything like it." Should she follow it? Maybe it's hurt or something? Making a decision, Maya took a step toward the Mustang. The horse's reaction was immediate. It tossed its head in what almost looked like relief, then continued walking away from the road, pausing occasionally to ensure Maya was still following. Maya kept her radio in hand, maintaining a running commentary for dispatch as she followed the Mustang away from the roadside and toward a grove of pines that ran alongside Pine Creek itself. "The Mustang is leading me northeast, approximately 100 yards from the roadway now. Animal appears calm and deliberate, no signs of injury or distress." As they moved further from the road, Maya became aware of the quieting sounds of traffic behind her, replaced by the gentle rush of the creek and the whisper of wind through the pines. The Mustang maintained a steady pace, always staying just far enough ahead to lead, but close enough to ensure Maya followed. They crossed a small clearing where Maya noticed something that made her pause, a set of hoof prints in the soft earth, seemingly from multiple horses. "Dispatch, I'm observing evidence that this Mustang may be part of a larger herd, continuing to follow at safe distance." The Mustang led her deeper into the pine grove, where the trees grew closer together and the ground became increasingly rocky and uneven. Maya's hand instinctively moved to her service weapon, not out of fear of the horse, but from years of training that had taught her to be cautious in unfamiliar territory. The sun was sinking faster now, shadows lengthening across the forest floor. Just as Maya was about to decide that following the Mustang any further would be unwise, the horse stopped and nickered softly. Maya paused, listening. At first, all she could hear was the natural sounds of the forest at dusk, birds settling for the night, the distant gurgle of the creek. Then she caught it. A human voice, faint but unmistakable. "Hello? Is someone there?" Maya called out, hand moving to the flashlight on her belt. The Mustang pawed the ground, then moved forward again with renewed purpose. They emerged into another small clearing, and Maya immediately saw what had motivated the horse's unusual behavior. On the far side of the clearing, partially concealed by fallen pine branches, lay a man. Maya rushed forward, all caution momentarily forgotten. "Sir, can you hear me?" The man was in his 60s, with a weathered face and silver hair. He lay awkwardly against a fallen log, his left leg bent at an angle that immediately told Maya it was broken. His face was pale beneath his tan, eyes closed, but as she approached they fluttered open. "The horses, are they okay?" were his first words, voice barely above a whisper. Maya knelt beside him, quickly assessing his condition while radioing for immediate medical assistance. "Sir, I'm Officer Delgado with Pine Ridge County Sheriff's Department. Don't try to move. Help is on the way. Can you tell me your name?" "James," he managed. "James Whitaker. I was tracking the Mustangs. My study group. How did you find me?" Maya glanced back at the chestnut Mustang, who stood at the edge of the clearing, watching them intently. "Actually, one of them found me. A small female with a white blaze. She caused quite a stir on Pine Creek Road." A look of astonishment crossed the man's face, followed by a weak smile. "Spirit," he whispered. "It was Spirit." While waiting for medical assistance, Maya did what she could to make James comfortable, using her jacket to stabilize his head and checking for other injuries. He drifted in and out of consciousness, but in his lucid moments, he shared fragments of information that began to piece together the remarkable story. James Whitaker was a wildlife biologist specializing in wild Mustang behavior. For the past 3 years, he had been studying a specific herd in the Pine Ridge area, documenting their social structures and migration patterns. Unlike many researchers, James had developed a unique approach that involved minimal interference, with the herd simply observing from a distance and tracking their movements through the changing seasons. "Spirit was born during my first year of study," James explained, his voice growing slightly stronger as Maya offered him water from her canteen. "I watched her grow from a foal, unusually intelligent, even for Mustangs." "But how did she know to find help?" Maya asked, still processing the extraordinary chain of events. James's eyes drifted to the chestnut Mustang, who had been joined by 2 other horses at the clearing's edge, a larger black stallion and a dun-colored mare. They kept their distance, but seemed to be watching the humans with undeniable interest. "I visited this herd hundreds of times," James said. "Always the same vehicle, same uniform colors. Spirit has seen me interact with other humans before. When I fell yesterday, couldn't move, couldn't reach my satellite phone. The herd stayed close. Spirit has always been the most curious about humans. Maya shook her head in wonder. So she recognized my uniform, associated it with humans who might help. Mustangs are far more intelligent than most people give them credit for, James replied, a hint of pride in his weak voice. They form strong social bonds, not just with each other. The sound of approaching helicopters cut through the evening air, and Maya stood using her flashlight to signal their position in the growing darkness. As the medical team arrived and began preparing James for transport, Maya found herself looking back at the small group of Mustangs still watching from the tree line. The chestnut mare, Spirit, held her gaze for a long moment before tossing her head and turning to disappear into the forest, the other Mustangs following her lead. Maya felt a lump form in her throat at the realization of what had just happened, how a wild animal had sought out human help for someone she recognized as part of her extended herd. As the medical team loaded James onto a stretcher, he reached out and grasped Maya's hand. My research, in my truck, parked at the North Trailhead. The keys are in my pocket. Promise me, you'll make sure people know what happened here, what Spirit did. It's important. Maya squeezed his hand gently. I promise, Mr. Whitaker, your truck and research will be safe. And this story... She looked toward where the Mustangs had disappeared. This is one I think people need to hear. As the helicopter lifted off, carrying James to the regional medical center, Maya stood alone in the clearing, the forest growing darker around her. She radioed her position to the backup units who were hiking in to meet her, but requested a few more minutes at the scene. In the quiet that followed, she thought she heard the distant sound of hoofbeats and a soft neighing that seemed almost like a farewell. Officer Maya Delgado had responded to thousands of calls in her career, but as she made her way back through the darkening forest, she knew this was one she would never forget. The day a wild Mustang with extraordinary intelligence and compassion had trusted a human enough to seek help for another. By the time she reached her patrol car, Maya had already decided that first thing tomorrow, she would visit James Whitaker at the hospital and learn everything she could about the remarkable Mustang named Spirit and the man who had earned her trust. Gentle piano music transitions in. Dawn broke over Pine Ridge County Hospital with a gentle wash of pink and gold. Officer Maya Delgado had managed only a few hours of restless sleep before returning to duty. The events of the previous evening played through her mind on an endless loop. The determined Mustang, the injured biologist, the extraordinary rescue that defied conventional understanding of animal behavior. She had filed her official report, trying to stick to the facts while knowing the full truth would sound too fantastical for a police document. The hospital corridors were quiet at this early hour as Maya made her way to the information desk, her uniform crisp despite her fatigue. She had James Whitaker's truck keys in her pocket. She'd secured his vehicle at the trailhead before heading home last night, but had resisted the temptation to look through his research materials without permission. I'm here to see James Whitaker, she told the nurse at the reception desk. He was brought in by helicopter yesterday evening. The nurse checked her computer. He's in room 318, just out of surgery for his leg, but the doctor says he's stable and can have visitors for short periods. Maya thanked her and took the elevator to the third floor. Outside room 318, she paused, uncertain what she would say to this man whose life had been saved by an animal that by all conventional wisdom should have had no concept of seeking human help. She knocked softly before entering. James Whitaker looked considerably better than when she'd found him in the forest. His color had returned, and though his left leg was elevated and encased in a serious-looking cast, his eyes were clear and alert. A woman in her 30s sat beside his bed. His daughter, Maya, would soon learn, and she looked up with curiosity as the officer entered. "Officer Delgado," James said, his voice much stronger than the whispers of yesterday. "I was hoping you'd come. This is my daughter, Emily." Emily Whitaker stood and extended her hand. "Thank you for finding my father. The doctor said if he'd spent another night out there..." She didn't finish the sentence, but the gratitude in her eyes said everything. "I can't take the credit," Maya replied, shaking Emily's hand. "If you want to thank someone, it would be a Mustang named Spirit." Emily exchanged a look with her father. "Dad tried to explain what happened, but honestly, it sounds unbelievable," Maya finished for her. "I know. I was there, and I'm still processing it myself." James motioned toward a chair. "Please sit. Tell Emily exactly what you witnessed. I want to make sure I'm not romanticizing what happened due to dehydration and pain medication." Maya sat and recounted the events in detail. The Mustang's deliberate behavior on the highway, how it had singled her out, and the way it had methodically led her to James. As she spoke, she noticed Emily's expression shifting from skepticism to wonder. "You're certain the horse wasn't just frightened and running randomly?" Emily asked, though her tone suggested she already believed Maya's account. "Absolutely certain," Maya replied. "I've dealt with frightened animals before. This was different, deliberate, focused. Your father called her Spirit," James nodded. "She's part of a herd I've been studying for 3 years, a remarkable animal from the beginning." He shifted in his bed, wincing slightly. "My research journals are in my truck, which is safe at the trailhead," Maya assured him, pulling the keys from her pocket and placing them on his bedside table. "I secured it last night." "Thank you." James looked relieved. "Those journals contain years of observations. Emily can help you retrieve them later if you're interested." "I am," Maya admitted. "Very interested." Emily studied Maya thoughtfully. "You really believe a wild horse deliberately sought human help?" "I do," Maya said without hesitation, "and I'd like to understand why and how." "Your father mentioned something about Spirit having seen him interact with humans before." James nodded, his eyes lighting up despite his obvious fatigue. "That's where my research differs from most wildlife biologists. I don't just observe the Mustangs. I deliberately let them observe me interacting with other researchers or rangers when they visit my observation sites. I've theorized that Mustangs, being highly social animals, learn not just from their own experiences, but from watching interactions between other species. Like how Spirit might have learned that humans in uniforms help other humans," Maya suggested. "Precisely," James agreed, "though I never imagined it would be tested so dramatically." A nurse entered then, reminding them that James needed rest. Maya stood to leave, but James caught her hand. "Officer Delgado, there's something else you should know," he said, his voice dropping slightly. "Something that makes Spirit's actions even more remarkable. It's all in my journals, but..." He glanced at Emily, who nodded encouragingly. "Spirit isn't just any Mustang from that herd. She was rescued as a foal by a veteran named Michael Ramirez, who found her abandoned after her mother was killed by a mountain lion." Maya felt her brow furrow with confusion. "A veteran? I thought you said you'd been studying her since birth." "I have," James confirmed, "but there's more to her story than I had time to explain yesterday. Michael rehabilitated Spirit, worked with her for nearly a year, then released her back to the wild when a local herd passed through his property. He contacted me because of my research, asked if I would keep an eye on her transition back to wildlife. Michael used to visit occasionally, watch her from a distance. He wore a uniform too, though different from yours." Emily picked up the thread of the story. Dad and Michael became friends, both of them fascinated by Spirit's development, how she balanced her early human contact with her new life in the wild herd. "Where is Michael now?" Maya asked, sensing there was more to this story. James, and Emily exchanged a glance that told Maya everything before they even spoke. Michael passed away last year, James said quietly. Cancer. He was only 42. Gulf War veteran with exposure to burn pits during his service. His last request was to be buried on his property, within sight of the valley where the Mustang herd often grazes. Maya felt a heaviness settle in her chest, and Spirit still recognizes human uniforms because of him. Yes, James said, but there's even more to it than that. Spirit regularly visits his grave. I've documented it numerous times. She'll break from the herd, stand at his burial site for several minutes, then rejoin the others. Behavior that has no explanation in conventional wildlife biology. The room fell silent as Maya absorbed this information. The story had just become even more extraordinary than she'd imagined. A horse rescued by a veteran, returned to the wild, yet maintaining a connection to humans that transcended typical animal behavior, even after the death of the man who had saved her. I'd like to see your documentation, Maya said finally. And visit Michael's property if possible, Emily nodded. I'll take you there myself. I promised Dad I'd check on the house anyway while he's recovering. The nurse returned, more insistent this time about James needing rest. Maya promised to return the following day, her mind buzzing with questions. As she and Emily exchanged contact information in the hospital corridor, Maya felt herself being drawn deeper into a story that challenged everything she thought she understood about the boundaries between humans and wild animals. Later that morning, after completing her shift reports, Maya found herself driving behind Emily's silver SUV, heading toward the Ramirez property on the western edge of the county. The landscape grew increasingly rugged and beautiful, rolling hills giving way to steeper terrain, with distant mountains framing the horizon. They turned onto a gravel road marked by a simple wooden sign that read Mustang Haven Ranch. After about a mile, a modest cabin came into view, nestled among pine trees with a breathtaking view of the valley below. Emily parked and waited for Maya to join her. Michael left the property to Dad in his will, Emily explained as they walked toward the cabin. They bonded over their love of Mustangs and the outdoors. Dad uses it as a base for his research during the summer months. Maya nodded, taking in the peaceful setting. A covered porch wrapped around the cabin, furnished with simple wooden chairs positioned to face the valley. She could imagine sitting there for hours, watching the Mustang herd in the distance. Michael's grave is this way, Emily said, leading Maya along a well-worn path that curved around the cabin and up a gentle slope. At the top stood a simple stone marker beneath the spreading branches of an ancient pine tree. The view from this spot was even more spectacular. The entire valley spread out below, a natural amphitheater that caught the midday sunlight. Maya approached the grave marker respectfully. It was a natural stone with a simple bronze plaque that read, Michael Ramirez, Staff Sergeant, U.S. Army, 1980-2022. The wild remembers what we forget. Beside the marker stood a weathered wooden post with what Maya recognized immediately as a military uniform jacket draped over it, faded camouflage with service patches still attached. The jacket moved slightly in the gentle breeze, giving it an almost lifelike quality. That was Michael's idea, Emily explained, noticing Maya's attention on the uniform. He told Dad that Spirit recognized him by his uniform more than his face or scent. He wanted to leave it here so she would know where to find him after he was gone. Maya felt her throat tighten with emotion. And your father says she visits regularly? Emily nodded, pulling out her phone and scrolling through photos. Dad set up wildlife cameras. Here. She handed Maya the phone, which displayed a series of time-stamped images. The chestnut Mustang with the distinctive white blaze standing at the grave marker, sometimes alone, sometimes with the rest of the herd visible in the background. The last image was taken just 3 days ago, Emily said quietly. 2 days before Spirit found you and led you to Dad. Maya handed the phone back, her mind working to process what this meant. So Spirit was visiting Michael's grave, then found your father injured not far from here and somehow understood that he needed human help. That's what it looks like, Emily agreed. Dad's documented dozens of cases of animal intelligence and even apparent empathy in his career, but nothing that approaches this level of, what would you call it, compassion, Maya said softly. Cross-species compassion. They stood in silence for a moment, the gravity of what they were witnessing settling around them. Then Emily straightened, a new determination in her posture. Let's get Dad's journals from the truck. There's more you should see. His documentation of Spirit's behavior over the past 3 years is extensive. And I think you're exactly the right person to help make sure this story is understood properly. As they walked back down the path toward their vehicles, Maya found herself scanning the valley below, wondering if Spirit and her herd were out there somewhere. The Mustang had already challenged everything Maya thought she knew about animal behavior. Now, with this new information about her connection to a veteran who had saved her life, the story was taking on dimensions that seemed almost mythic. Yet Maya had seen the truth with her own eyes. She had followed a wild Mustang through the forest to find a man in desperate need. That Mustang had recognized a uniform similar to one worn by a man who had once saved her life, a man who was now gone, but whose memory lived on in the most unexpected of ways. As they reached the vehicles, Emily paused, shading her eyes against the sun as she looked out over the valley. "Look," she said quietly, pointing toward a distant ridge. Maya followed her gaze and caught her breath. Silhouetted against the sky stood a small group of Mustangs, too far away to identify individuals clearly, but unmistakable in their wild grace. They remained for just a moment before disappearing over the ridge, leaving Maya with a sense of wonder that she knew would stay with her for a very long time. Heartfelt string music fades in. Emily handed Maya a weathered leather journal from the collection they'd retrieved from James's truck. The two women had settled on the cabin's porch, a pot of coffee between them as the afternoon sun cast long shadows across the valley. Maya opened the journal carefully, immediately struck by James Whitaker's meticulous documentation. Detailed sketches of individual Mustangs, charts tracking herd movements, and pages of handwritten observations. "Start with the blue tab," Emily suggested, refilling Maya's coffee mug. "That's when Spirit first appeared." Maya turned to the marked page and began reading. James's neat handwriting told the story of a phone call from Michael Ramirez 3 years ago, describing how he'd found an orphaned Mustang foal while hiking in the backcountry. The mother had been killed by a predator, likely a mountain lion, and the foal was severely dehydrated and injured. Michael wasn't planning to intervene, Emily explained as Maya read. He knew the risks of habituating wild animals to humans, but the foal wouldn't have survived alone, and there was no herd in sight. James's journal detailed Michael's agonizing decision to carry the foal 3 miles back to his truck, then bring her to his property for emergency care. The entries over the following weeks documented the foal's recovery, including photographs of a tiny chestnut Mustang with a distinctive, white blaze, unmistakably Spirit. He named her Spirit of Freedom, Emily said, but just called her Spirit for short. Said she had a fighting spirit that reminded him of some of the soldiers he'd served with. Maya turned the page to find a photograph that made her breath catch. Michael Ramirez in his army uniform, kneeling beside the growing foal. He was a handsome man with kind eyes and the watchful expression Maya had seen in many veterans, alert, assessing, protective. Michael knew from the beginning that Spirit needed to return to the wild, Emily continued. He contacted Dad because of his reputation for studying Mustang behavior. They developed a rehabilitation plan designed to give Spirit the care she needed while minimizing human imprinting. The journal detailed their innovative approach. Michael wore his uniform whenever he fed or treated Spirit, while wearing completely different clothing and staying out of sight for all other activities. The theory was that Spirit would associate only the uniform with human interaction, reducing the risk that she would approach other humans indiscriminately when returned to the wild. "It worked better than they anticipated," Emily said, pointing to entries from later months. Spirit became selectively responsive to the uniform, but remained wary of humans otherwise, exactly what they hoped for. Maya continued reading, fascinated by James's documentation of the day they released Spirit back to the wild. A local herd had been grazing in the valley near Michael's property, and after careful observation, Michael and James had determined that the herd had a stable social structure with a nurturing lead mare who might accept a young outsider. The release itself had been emotional, but successful. Spirit initially stayed close to the property edge, then gradually integrated with the herd over several weeks. James had set up observation points to monitor her transition, documenting how she negotiated her place in the Mustang hierarchy while maintaining an unusual awareness of human presence. "This is remarkable," Maya said, looking up from the journal. "The careful thought they put into her rehabilitation, the documentation of her behavior. It's like nothing I've ever heard of." Emily nodded. "Dad's been doing wildlife research for 30 years, but he says the work with Spirit taught him more about animal cognition than all his previous studies combined." Maya turned to another tabbed section, this one marked with a red flag. Immediately she understood why. These entries documented the progression of Michael's illness. He had been diagnosed with an aggressive cancer linked to his exposure to toxic burn pits during his military service in Iraq. The prognosis had been grim from the start, 6 months, perhaps a year, with aggressive treatment. Michael refused to be treated at a distant hospital, Emily explained, her voice softening. He wanted to remain here, where he could see the Mustangs. Dad arranged for home hospice care and spent much of that time here with him. The journal entries became more personal during this period, recording not just observations of Spirit, but conversations between James and Michael as they sat on the porch watching the Mustang herd. Michael had spoken often about how Spirit represented something he'd struggled to define since returning from combat, a perfect balance between freedom and connection, wildness and trust. Maya turned the page to find a remarkable entry. May 15th, 2022. Extraordinary observation today. Michael had a difficult morning with severe pain. Hospice nurse visited and increased his medication. Around noon, I wheeled him to the porch as usual so he could watch the valley. We were stunned to see Spirit break from the herd and approach the property boundary, closer than she's come in months. She stood watching the cabin for nearly 20 minutes before returning to the herd. I've documented Mustangs' sensitivity to changes in their environment, but this goes beyond territorial awareness. Did she somehow sense Michael's deteriorating condition? His uniform jacket was visible on the porch railing where we hang it daily. At his request, did she recognize it from this distance? No scientific framework exists to explain this behavior satisfactorily. Maya looked up at Emily, who had been watching her reaction. "This happened repeatedly," Emily said quietly. As Michael grew weaker, Spirit's visits became more frequent. The hospice nurses couldn't explain it. Dad couldn't explain it. But Michael wasn't surprised at all. "What did he say about it?" Maya asked. Emily gazed out at the valley, now bathed in late afternoon light. He said that Spirit was teaching him how to navigate the border between two worlds. Just as she lived between wildness and domestication, he was learning to live between life and what comes after. Maya felt a shiver run through her despite the warmth of the day. She turned to the next entry, which documented Michael's final request: to be buried on the property within sight of the Mustang herd's regular grazing grounds, with his uniform jacket placed on a post beside his grave. Dad thought it was symbolic. Emily said, a gesture of Michael's ongoing connection to spirit and the herd, but it became something much more tangible after he passed. The journal entries following Michael's death documented something that defied conventional scientific explanation. 2 days after the funeral, James had observed Spirit approaching the gravesite alone, standing there for several minutes before returning to the herd. Initially, James had attributed it to coincidence or his own grief-influenced perception. But when it happened again a week later, he set up wildlife cameras to document the phenomenon objectively. The cameras captured what James's journal described as a ritual visitation pattern. Every 10 to 14 days, Spirit would separate from the herd and stand at or near Michael's grave for periods ranging from 5 to 20 minutes. Sometimes she would approach the uniform jacket on its post, seeming to smell it or touch it with her muzzle. Other times, she would simply stand at a slight distance facing the grave marker. The scientific community would likely attribute this to coincidence or anthropomorphism, Maya said, thinking aloud. They'd say we're projecting human emotions onto animal behavior. Emily smiled slightly. Dad anticipated that reaction. That's why he documented everything so meticulously. The frequency, duration, weather conditions, herd activities during Spirit's absences. He ruled out other explanations one by one. The grave isn't near a water source or special vegetation. It's not on a natural pathway or territory boundary. The only constant is Michael's presence, or rather, his absence that Spirit somehow seems to recognize. Maya closed the journal, her mind working to integrate this extraordinary information with what she had witnessed herself the previous day. And now Spirit has done something even more inexplicable. Recognized that James was in danger and deliberately sought human help by finding me. Yes, Emily said simply. Dad believes that Michael created a bridge of understanding between Spirit and humans that transcends conventional animal behavior. He taught her that humans in uniforms can help in times of need. Maya stood and walked to the porch railing, looking out over the valley as the setting sun painted the landscape in gold and crimson. She thought about the chestnut Mustang with the white blaze who had approached her cruiser with such determination, who had led her through the forest to save a man's life. A wild animal with an understanding of human help that went beyond instinct or conditioning. I've been a police officer for 12 years, Maya said finally. I've seen a lot of remarkable things, but nothing that compares to this. Emily joined her at the railing. Dad wants to publish his findings, but he's been hesitant. The scientific community can be ruthless toward research that appears to attribute human-like understanding to animals. And there's another concern. If Spirit's story becomes widely known, it could draw unwanted attention to the herd. Maya understood immediately. Wild Mustangs were protected by federal law, but their existence remained precarious in many areas. Due to competition for grazing land and resources, a Mustang exhibiting extraordinary behavior could become a tourist attraction or worse, a target for those seeking to capture or exploit such an unusual animal. What does your father want to do? Maya asked. He wants to continue his research, document Spirit's behavior more comprehensively, and Emily hesitated. He mentioned yesterday that he'd like you to be involved. Maya turned to her in surprise. Me? I'm not a scientist or researcher. No, but you've witnessed something remarkable firsthand. Your perspective as a law enforcement officer adds credibility to the documentation, and Spirit approached you specifically. That creates a connection that might be valuable for further observation. Maya considered this unexpected invitation. Her scheduled vacation was coming up in 2 weeks, time she had planned to spend catching up on home projects and perhaps visiting her sister in Colorado. But the pull of this extraordinary story was powerful. "I'd need to learn more about your father's research methods," she said cautiously, "and understand exactly what role he envisions for me." Emily smiled. "He'll be thrilled, and between his journals and my assistance, you'd have everything you need to get started." As they discussed the possibilities, the light faded from the valley, and Emily suggested they return to town before darkness made the drive more challenging. They gathered James's journals and locked up the cabin, both women lost in thought as they walked to their vehicles. Just as Maya reached her cruiser, a sound from the valley caught her attention, the distant drumming of hoofbeats. She and Emily turned toward the sound, straining to see in the dimming light. Along the ridge that formed the valley's eastern boundary, a small group of Mustangs appeared in silhouette against the darkening sky. "Is that?" Maya began. "The herd," Emily confirmed. "And look, in front." Maya squinted, her heart beating faster as she recognized the distinctive profile of a smaller Mustang leading the group, a chestnut mare with a white blaze down her face. "Spirit," she whispered. The Mustangs paused on the ridge, and for a moment, Maya was certain that Spirit was looking directly at them. Then, with a toss of her head, the mare led the herd over the ridge and out of sight, leaving only the echo of hoofbeats in the twilight silence. Maya felt tears spring unexpectedly to her eyes, tears of wonder, of connection to something that transcended her understanding of the natural world. In that moment, she knew she would accept James's invitation. There was a story here that needed to be documented and shared, a demonstration of cross-species compassion and memory that could change how humans understood their relationship with the wild world. As she drove back toward town, following the glow of Emily's taillights on the winding road, Maya found herself thinking of Michael Ramirez, a veteran who had saved a wild Mustang's life, only to have that same Mustang create a legacy of connection that continued beyond his death. It was a story of reciprocal healing, of bonds that defied conventional understanding, and now, through an extraordinary chain of events, Maya had become part of that story. Tomorrow she would visit James in the hospital again, tell him she wanted to help with his research, and perhaps in the days to come she would have her own encounter with Spirit, not as an officer responding to a traffic disruption, but as someone invited into a circle of trust that bridged the human and wild worlds, in ways science was only beginning to understand. Soft, reflective piano music. 2 weeks passed quickly. James Whitaker had been released from the hospital with strict instructions to limit his physical activity while his broken leg healed. He had taken up residence in the cabin on Michael's property, insisting that being close to his research was essential to his recovery. Emily divided her time between her job in town and caring for her father, while Maya found herself drawn to the property whenever she was off duty. Today marked the official start of Maya's vacation, and she had arrived. At the cabin shortly after dawn, a thermos of coffee and a bag of fresh pastries in hand. The morning air was crisp with the first hints of autumn, dew sparkling on the grass as she made her way up the path. She found James already on the porch, his leg propped up on a cushioned stool, binoculars in hand as he scanned the valley below. Over the past 2 weeks, his color had improved dramatically, and though he still moved carefully, his energy was returning. "Perfect timing," he said as Maya approached. "The herd is in the east meadow this morning, and I think I spotted Spirit near the ridge about 20 minutes ago." Maya handed him a coffee and settled into the chair beside him, accepting the spare pair of binoculars he offered. She had quickly learned the basics of wildlife observation under James's patient guidance, discovering an unexpected joy in the quiet hours of watching and waiting. Any sign of the new foal? She asked, adjusting her binoculars to focus on the distant cluster of horses. James smiled. Briefly, about an hour ago, the herd is being typically protective, keeping the little ones surrounded most of the time. The past 2 weeks had revealed a whole new dimension to Maya's understanding of wild Mustangs. She had learned to identify individual horses within the herd, to recognize basic behavior patterns, and to appreciate the complex social structure that governed their interactions. Spirit, as James had documented extensively, occupied an unusual position within the herd. Not the lead mare, but respected and often given space for her independent explorations. "I've been thinking about your question," James said, after they had observed in comfortable silence for several minutes, "about whether Spirit would have sought human help if it had been someone other than me, injured in the forest." Maya lowered her binoculars. It was a question that had occupied her thoughts as well. Would Spirit have recognized that any human needed assistance, or was her response specific to James because of his connection to Michael? "And what do you think?" she asked. James considered carefully before answering. "I believe Spirit's understanding of human assistance is connected specifically to uniforms. Michael deliberately wore his military uniform during their interactions. I wear similar field clothes each time I observe the herd. And you were in your officer's uniform when she approached." "You?" Maya nodded slowly, a visual cue she associates with helping behavior. "Exactly," James agreed. It's not that she understands the concept of injury or assistance in abstract terms. Rather, she's developed a specific association between uniformed humans and positive outcomes based on her experiences with Michael. This explanation made sense to Maya, fitting within the framework of animal cognition without requiring supernatural abilities. Yet it didn't diminish the remarkable nature of what Spirit had done, recognizing a situation that required intervention and seeking out the appropriate help. "I've noted something else interesting," James continued, gesturing toward his research journal on the table between them. "Since the rescue, Spirit's visits to Michael's grave have increased in frequency. Previously, she would visit approximately every 2 weeks. In the past 14 days, she's been observed at the site 4 times. Maya had witnessed one of these visits herself 3 days ago. She and James had been observing from the cabin porch, when Spirit had separated from the herd and made her way deliberately toward the hill where Michael was buried. Maya had followed at a distance, watching as the Mustang stood quietly by the grave for nearly 15 minutes, occasionally moving closer to the uniform jacket on its post. "What do you make of that increased frequency?" Maya asked. James shook his head slightly. "I try not to anthropomorphize, but it's difficult not to see it as some form of, I don't know, processing? As if the rescue situation activated her memories of Michael and intensified that connection." They fell silent again, each lost in thought as they scanned the valley. The herd had begun moving toward the small creek that wound through the east meadow, their movements unhurried and purposeful. In the morning light, after a while, James lowered his binoculars and turned to Maya with a more serious expression. "There's something else we need to discuss, something I haven't mentioned yet." Maya recognized his tone and gave him her full attention. "What is it?" James sighed. "There's a Bureau of Land Management meeting next week about wild horse management in this region. Emily received notice yesterday. They're considering a gather operation that would affect this herd." Maya felt a knot form in her stomach. She had learned enough about Mustang management issues to understand the implications. A roundup, but why? This herd isn't overpopulated. "No, they're not," James agreed. "But there's pressure from some of the ranchers in the area who want access to more grazing land for their cattle. And there's a new resort development being planned for the North Ridge area. The BLM is caught in the middle as usual." The thought of Spirit and her herd being rounded up and potentially separated sent a wave of dismay through Maya. Wild horse gathers were controversial but legal management tools, often resulting in Mustangs being held in government holding facilities or put up for adoption. Many never returned to the wild. "What can we do?" she asked. "The meeting is public. Citizens can speak and present information for consideration." James tapped his research journal. "My documentation of this herd, particularly Spirit's remarkable behavior, could potentially influence the decision. Mustangs exhibiting unique cognitive abilities and cultural behaviors like grave visitation. That's significant from a conservation standpoint." Maya understood what he was suggesting. "You want to present your research at the meeting?" "I do," James confirmed. "But given my current condition, I'll need help preparing the presentation and organizing the documentation. Emily can assist with some of it, but she's already taking on so much with my care and her own work." "I'll help," Maya said without hesitation. "I have 2 weeks of vacation time, and I can't think of anything more important than this." Relief washed over James's face. "Thank you. It won't be easy. We'll need to present the research in a way that's scientifically credible while making it accessible to non-specialists. And we need to be careful about how we frame Spirit's behavior. Too much emphasis on the extraordinary aspects could lead to unwanted attention." Maya nodded her understanding. Over the next 3 days, she and James worked tirelessly, reviewing his years of field notes, selecting the most compelling photographic evidence, and crafting a presentation that highlighted the cultural and cognitive complexity of the Pine Ridge Mustang herd. James's scientific expertise, combined with Maya's perspective as a law enforcement officer, created a powerful narrative about the value of preserving this particular herd in its native habitat. On the 4th day of Maya's vacation, as they were finalizing their presentation materials, Emily arrived at the cabin with unexpected news. "You won't believe who I just spoke with," she said, excitement evident in her voice as she joined them on the porch. "Congressman David Torres. He's on the House Natural Resources Committee, and he's agreed to attend the BLM meeting." James looked up from his laptop in surprise. "Torres? How did you manage that?" Emily smiled. "I didn't. It was Michael's connection. Remember, I mentioned that Michael served with someone who went into politics. That was Torres. When I learned he was going to be in the state next week, I took a chance and reached out to his office, explaining Michael's connection to this land and the Mustangs." Maya felt a surge of hope. Having a congressional representative at the meeting, especially one with a personal connection to Michael Ramirez, could significantly influence the outcome. "There's more," Emily continued. "Torres asked if he could visit the property before the meeting, see Michael's grave, and learn about his connection to the Mustangs. He's coming tomorrow afternoon." The next morning brought clear skies and a gentle breeze, perfect conditions for Congressman Torres's visit. Maya arrived early to help James and Emily prepare, bringing fresh flowers for Michael's grave and helping to organize James's research materials for presentation. Congressman Torres arrived precisely at the scheduled time, accompanied by a single aide rather than the entourage they had half expected. He was younger than Maya had anticipated, perhaps in his mid-40s, with the disciplined posture of a military man and eyes that quickly assessed his surroundings. "Dr. Whitaker," he said, extending his hand to James, "thank you for agreeing to this visit on such short notice, and you must be Emily. Michael spoke of you often in his letters." Emily nodded, visibly moved by this connection to her father's friend. "He mentioned you as well, Congressman. This is Officer Maya Delgado, who's been instrumental in documenting Spirit's behavior." Torres shook Maya's hand with a warm smile. "I understand you had quite an extraordinary experience with one of the Mustangs. I'm eager to hear about it." They settled on the porch, where James had prepared a brief presentation of his research. As he explained the unique characteristics of the Pine Ridge herd and the special case of Spirit, Torres listened attentively, occasionally asking insightful questions that revealed his genuine interest and knowledge of wildlife conservation issues. When James finished, Torres sat back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. "This is remarkable work, Dr. Whitaker. And the timing of your presentation at the BLM meeting couldn't be more crucial. There are significant forces pushing for expanded development in this region. Then you understand our concerns about the proposed gather," Emily said. Torres nodded. "I do. And while I can't promise to intervene directly in the BLM's decision-making process, I can ensure that all the relevant information is considered, including your research on the cognitive and cultural aspects of this herd." Maya felt a cautious optimism rising. Torres seemed genuinely impressed by James's research and moved by the connection to his former comrade. When he asked to visit Michael's grave, Maya offered to guide him, leaving James to rest his leg while Emily prepared lunch. As they walked up the path to the gravesite, Torres shared stories of his service with Michael, their deployment together, the challenges they had faced, and the bond that had formed between them in the difficult conditions of war. "Michael was the kind of soldier who noticed things others missed," Torres said as they approached the grave. "Wildlife, local customs, subtle changes in the environment. He had an awareness that saved our unit more than once." Maya thought about Spirit with her own remarkable awareness. His friend James believes that's what made him special to Spirit. His ability to see her as an individual, not just a species to be rescued. They reached the grave, and Torres stood silently for a moment, reading the inscription on the plaque. His gaze then moved to the uniform jacket on its post, weathered by years of sun and rain, but still recognizably military. "Michael wrote to me about the Mustang he rescued," Torres said quietly. "Said she taught him more about healing than all the VA therapists combined. I thought he was being poetic, but now I understand what he meant." As if on cue, a movement in the valley below caught their attention. Maya's breath caught as she recognized the distinctive form of Spirit separated from the herd and moving with purpose toward the base of the hill. "Congressman," she said softly, "that's Spirit. The Mustang Michael rescued." Torres turned, following her gaze to where the chestnut mare had paused, looking up the hill toward them. "Remarkable timing," he murmured. "Not timing," Maya corrected gently. "She visits the grave regularly. James has documented it extensively." They watched in silence as Spirit began to climb the hill, moving with the sure-footed grace of a wild horse who knew the terrain intimately. Maya had never seen her approach while humans were present at the grave, and she felt a flutter of concern that they might disturb this mysterious ritual. "Should we move away?" Torres asked, seemingly reading her thoughts. Before Maya could answer, Spirit stopped about 30 yards from them, her ears forward, her posture alert, but not alarmed. She regarded them for a long moment, then lowered, her head to graze casually, as if their presence was acceptable as long as they maintained their distance. Torres stood transfixed, watching the wild Mustang with an expression of wonder. "In all my years of working on conservation legislation, I've never seen anything like this," he said. "This isn't just about protecting land or a species. This is about preserving something profound." Maya nodded, understanding exactly what he meant. What they were witnessing transcended typical wildlife behavior. It spoke to connections between species, to memory and emotion that defied simple scientific explanation. As they watched, Spirit raised her head again, looking directly toward Michael's grave. For several minutes, she stood perfectly still, as if paying her respects. Then, with a soft, nickering sound, she turned and made her way back down the hill toward her waiting herd. Torres remained silent for a long time after Spirit had disappeared from view. When he finally spoke, his voice held a new resolve. "I think I've just witnessed something that changes everything about this discussion," he said. "This isn't just a land management issue or a wildlife conservation matter. This is about honoring a legacy, Michael's legacy, and the extraordinary connection he fostered." As they walked back to the cabin, Torres outlined what he intended to do, not just speak at the BLM meeting, but propose a special designation for this area as a cultural and scientific heritage site, offering protection not only for the Mustangs, but for the unique relationship they had developed with humans. Maya felt tears of relief and gratitude spring to her eyes as she realized what this could mean for Spirit and her herd. What had begun as a strange encounter on a rural highway, a wild Mustang chasing after a police cruiser, had led to something she could never have imagined. A movement to preserve not just an animal species, but a remarkable example of cross-species connection. Uplifting orchestral music begins. The Bureau of Land Management office in Pine Ridge was packed beyond capacity. Ranchers in well-worn hats sat alongside environmental activists with clipboards. Local residents mingled with representatives from various government agencies. The scheduled meeting about wild horse management had drawn an unexpectedly large crowd, fueled by rumors of congressional interest and whispers about a Mustang with extraordinary abilities. Maya sat beside James in the front row, his research materials organized neatly in folders before them. Emily stood near the back wall, coordinating with a small group of volunteers who had offered to distribute summaries of James's research to attendees. The atmosphere was tense with competing interests, ranchers concerned about grazing land, developers eyeing property values, conservationists fighting for wildlife protection. "Quite a turnout," James murmured, scanning the crowd. "I hadn't anticipated this level of interest." Maya nodded, equally surprised by the packed room. Word travels fast in small communities, and having Congressman Torres attend probably doubled the attendance. As if summoned by his name, David Torres entered the room, accompanied by his aide and the regional BLM director. A murmur passed through the crowd as people recognized the congressman. He nodded to Maya and James as he made his way to the front, stopping briefly to shake hands with several community members. The meeting began with standard procedural matters, introductions, agenda review, and a presentation from the BLM officials about wild horse population management challenges in the region. Maya listened attentively as maps and statistics were displayed, noting how the presentation framed the issue primarily as a land use conflict requiring technical resolution. When the BLM director introduced James as the next speaker, Maya squeezed his arm encouragingly. Despite his still healing leg, James had insisted on presenting his research personally. With Maya's help, he made his way to the podium, his crutches tucked discreetly beside him as he addressed the assembled crowd. "Thank you for the opportunity to speak today," he began, his voice carrying clearly through the room. "For the past 3 years, I've been conducting behavioral research on the Pine Ridge Mustang herd, with a particular focus on their social structures, territorial patterns, and cognitive abilities." James proceeded to present his findings with the measured precision of a seasoned scientist, careful to ground his observations in data while conveying the unique characteristics of the herd. He explained their stable population numbers, their minimal impact on the ecosystem compared to other grazers, and their cultural transmission of knowledge across generations. Then, with a nod to Maya, he shifted to the extraordinary case of Spirit. The Mustang rescued by veteran Michael Ramirez, reintegrated into the wild herd, and now exhibiting behaviors that challenged conventional understanding of animal cognition. What we are observing with this particular mare goes beyond basic conditioning or simple associative learning, James explained, displaying photographs from his wildlife cameras. Her regular visitation of her rescuer's gravesite, her apparent recognition of human uniforms as sources of assistance, and most recently, her deliberate seeking of human help when she encountered an injured person. These behaviors suggest a level of cross-species understanding that merits serious scientific attention. A ripple of murmurs passed through the audience. While some faces showed skepticism, many leaned forward with evident interest. James continued, outlining the scientific implications of his observations and their relevance to wildlife management. Decisions. I'm not suggesting that this herd should receive special treatment solely because of one remarkable individual, he clarified. Rather, I'm proposing that this population represents a unique opportunity to study cognitive and cultural development in wild horses, an opportunity that would be irrevocably lost if the herd were to be gathered and dispersed. As James concluded his presentation, the room erupted in questions. Ranchers challenged his assessment of the herd's environmental impact. Conservationists sought more details about Spirit's behavior. Local residents expressed both support for the Mustangs and concerns about land use restrictions. Throughout the questioning, James maintained his scientific composure, acknowledging limitations in his data while standing firm on his core observations. When a particularly skeptical rancher dismissed the grave visitation behavior as made-up nonsense to block proper land management, James simply offered to show him the time-stamped footage from multiple wildlife cameras. After nearly 40 minutes of increasingly heated discussion, the BLM director called for a brief recess before the public comment period would begin. As attendees filed out for refreshments, Congressman Torres made his way to where Maya and James sat. "Impressive presentation, Dr. Whitaker," Torres said, taking the seat beside them. "You've given us all a lot to consider." James nodded appreciatively. "Thank you, Congressman, though I sense there's still significant opposition to preserving the herd's territory." "Yes, the economic interests are substantial," Torres acknowledged. "The proposed resort development alone represents millions in potential revenue for the county, and the ranchers have legitimate concerns about grazing access." Maya felt her heart sink. Even with Torres's support and James's compelling research, the practical realities of land management politics might prevail. "So, you think the gather will proceed?" she asked. Torres's expression remained carefully neutral. "I think this decision, like most natural resource matters, will ultimately be about balancing competing values. The question is whether we're measuring all the relevant values correctly." Before he could elaborate, the doors at the back of the queue room burst open and a young woman rushed in, making a beeline for Emily. They spoke in urgent whispers, with Emily's expression shifting from concern to disbelief. After a moment, Emily hurried toward them. "Dad, Officer Delgado," she said breathlessly, "you need to come outside. Now." Something in her tone brooked no argument. James gathered his crutches while Maya and Torres followed Emily toward the exit. The other meeting attendees, sensing something unusual, began to follow as well. Outside the BLM office, a small crowd had already gathered at the edge of the parking lot, pointing and exclaiming. As Maya pushed through to see what had caused the commotion, she stopped abruptly, hardly believing her eyes. At the far end of the parking area, standing perfectly still beneath a lone pine tree, was Spirit. The chestnut Mustang with her distinctive white blaze stood just beyond the line of parked cars, her posture alert but calm despite the gathering crowd. Behind her, at a greater distance, Maya could see several other Mustangs from the herd. The dark stallion and two mares waiting watchfully on the grassy hillside beyond the lot. "This is unprecedented," James whispered, leaning heavily on his crutches. "They never come this close to town, let alone to a building with this many people." Maya scanned the scene, her police training automatically assessing for safety concerns. The Mustangs weren't acting agitated, but wild horses near a crowd of excited humans created obvious risks. She began quietly asking people to step back, creating space between the onlookers and the animals. "Has anything like this happened before?" Torres asked, his voice hushed with wonder. James shook his head, never taking his eyes off Spirit. "Never. Wild Mustangs typically avoid human settlements entirely." As the crowd maintained a respectful distance under Maya's guidance, something even more remarkable occurred. Spirit took several deliberate steps forward, moving directly toward where Maya, James, and Torres stood. The Mustang stopped about 20 yards away, her gaze fixed on them with unmistakable intensity. "She's focusing on you, Congressman," Maya said softly. "On your uniform." Torres looked down at his suit jacket with its military service pin on the lapel, a subtle but distinct marker of his connection to Michael Ramirez. "My God," he murmured, "she recognizes it." For several breathtaking moments, Spirit held her position, creating a tableau that no one present would ever forget. A wild Mustang, voluntarily approaching humans, creating a bridge between two worlds that were typically separated by fear and conflict. Then, with a soft nickering sound, Spirit tossed her head and turned, trotting back to where the other Mustangs waited. The small group watched for a moment before disappearing over the hillside, leaving behind a stunned silence. The crowd erupted in excited chatter. Phones had captured the entire encounter, and Maya could already hear people discussing what they'd witnessed. Some were awestruck, others skeptical, but no one remained unmoved by the Mustang's unexpected appearance. When they returned to the meeting room, the atmosphere had transformed. What had been a contentious policy discussion now carried an almost reverential quality. People who had been arguing vehemently minutes earlier now spoke in hushed tones about what they had seen. As the public comment period began, speaker after speaker referenced the Mustang's appearance. Ranchers who had initially opposed any special designation for the herd now suggested compromise solutions. Local business owners spoke of potential ecotourism opportunities that could rival or exceed the proposed resort development. When Congressman Torres finally took the podium, the room fell silent in anticipation. He began by acknowledging the complex economic and environmental factors at play, demonstrating his understanding of all stakeholders' concerns. Then his tone shifted to something more personal. What we witnessed today goes beyond policy considerations or resource management, he said, his gaze sweeping the room. Some might call it coincidence that a wild Mustang appeared at precisely this moment. Others might attribute it to learned behavior or simple curiosity. But as someone who served alongside Michael Ramirez, who has now seen firsthand the connection he fostered with these animals, I believe we're encountering something far more significant. Torres paused, gathering his thoughts before continuing. Throughout human history, certain animals have served as messengers between worlds, symbols that transcend our normal categories and challenge us to see beyond immediate concerns. Today, I believe we encountered such a messenger. Maya felt tears welling in her eyes as Torres continued, proposing a solution that honored all interests while preserving the heart of what made the Pine Ridge Mustangs unique. He outlined a plan for a special conservation area that would protect the core territory of the herd while allowing limited regulated grazing for local ranchers. Instead of a large resort development, he proposed a smaller, sustainable ecotourism center that would highlight the Mustangs' remarkable story while ensuring their continued freedom. And central to this proposal, Torres concluded, I am recommending federal funding for Dr. Whitaker's research program to help us better understand the cognitive and cultural capacities of these extraordinary animals. What began as one veteran's act of compassion toward an orphaned foal has created a legacy that deserves our protection and our study. As the meeting adjourned with tentative agreement to explore Torres's proposal further, Maya found herself standing outside with James and Emily, watching the sunset paint the distant mountains in gold and crimson. "Do you think it will work?" Emily asked, hope and caution mingling in her voice. James nodded slowly. "Torres has significant influence, and after what everyone witnessed today, yes, I believe we have a fighting chance." Maya's thoughts turned to Spirit, to the incredible series of events that had brought them all to this moment. From a traffic disruption on a rural highway to a proposal for a new kind of conservation area, all because a Mustang had formed a bond with a veteran that transcended expectations, species boundaries, and even death. "I never expected my career to take this turn," Maya admitted, "from law enforcement to wildlife advocacy." James smiled. "The best journeys are the ones we never planned." Michael used to say that about his time with Spirit, that she led him down a path he never anticipated, but exactly the one he needed. As they drove back to the cabin in the fading light, Maya found herself watching the shadowed landscape, wondering if Spirit and her herd were out there, moving through their ancient patterns across the land they called home. Thanks to one remarkable Mustang's understanding of human connection, that land might now remain theirs for generations to come. The next morning dawned clear and cool, a perfect autumn day in Montana. Maya arrived at the cabin to find James already, on the porch, coffee in hand, gazing out at the valley below. "Any sign of them?" she asked, accepting the mug he offered her. "Not yet," James replied, "but they often graze in the east meadow around mid-morning." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the play of light across the landscape as the sun climbed higher. After yesterday's emotional intensity, the quiet felt healing, a space to process all that had occurred. "I had a call from Torres this morning," James said eventually. "He's already spoken with the regional BLM director. They're fast-tracking the special designation proposal, calling it the Ramirez Mustang Heritage Area. If approved, it would protect nearly 40,000 acres, including all of the herd's primary territory." Maya felt a surge of hope. "That's wonderful news. And the research funding? Promising," James nodded. "Torres believes he can secure initial funding through a conservation science initiative, enough to establish a proper research program with staff and equipment." He turned to Maya with a questioning look. "Which brings me to something I wanted to discuss with you." Maya met his gaze, already sensing what he might ask. Over the past weeks, she had discovered a passion for this work that had taken her by surprise, a connection to the Mustangs and their story that felt increasingly meaningful. "I've been thinking about a career change," James continued, "or rather, an evolution, moving from pure research to something that combines scientific study with public education and advocacy, and I'd like you to consider being part of it." Maya looked out over the valley, considering his words. She had 12 years invested in law enforcement, a career she had chosen with conviction and served with pride. Yet something about this new possibility called to her in a way she couldn't ignore. "I'd need to learn so much," she said thoughtfully. "I'm not a scientist or a researcher, but you are an excellent observer, a skilled communicator, and someone who has experienced firsthand the extraordinary connection we're studying," James countered. "Those qualities are invaluable. The scientific methods can be taught." As they discussed possibilities, the sun climbed higher, bathing the valley in golden light. And there, in the distance, moving with unhurried grace across the east meadow, appeared the Mustang herd, wild and free on ancestral lands that might now remain their home for generations to come. Soft string music with gentle piano. 6 months passed in a whirlwind of activity. Winter settled over Pine Ridge County, blanketing the mountains and valleys in pristine snow. The Mustang herd had moved to their traditional winter grazing grounds in the lower elevation meadows, where the snow was shallower and the wind less biting. James's research program, now officially named the Ramirez Mustang Research Initiative, had secured its funding and established a small but dedicated team. Maya stood by the large window in what had once been Michael's cabin living room and was now the initiative's main office. The space had been thoughtfully renovated, expanded to accommodate research equipment and meeting areas while preserving the rustic character that made it blend with the landscape. Outside, the December morning was bright and clear, the sun reflecting brilliantly off the snow-covered valley. The satellite tracking data just came in, called Emily from her desk across the room. In the months since the BLM meeting, she had transitioned from her previous job to become the initiative's administrative director, bringing organizational skills that complemented her father's scientific expertise. Maya joined her at the computer screen, where a map displayed the movements of the Mustang herd over the past week. 3 of the horses, including Spirit, had been fitted with non-invasive tracking collars, lightweight devices specially designed to fall off after a predetermined period, allowing researchers to follow the herd's winter migration patterns without permanent interference. They're staying consistently within the protected area, Maya observed, studying the colorful tracking lines that showed the herd's movements. That's good news. Emily nodded in agreement. Dad will be pleased. He was concerned they might venture too close to the Dixon property during winter. The Dixon Ranch bordered the newly established Ramirez Mustang Heritage Area to the northwest, one of the few neighboring properties that had opposed the conservation designation. Though the final boundaries had been drawn to minimize conflicts, relations with the Dixon family remained tense. Speaking of your father, Maya said, glancing at her watch, we should head out if we're going to meet him at the observation point by noon. They bundled up in heavy winter gear, insulated boots, thick parkas, and the research team's distinctive blue knit caps with the initiative's logo, a silhouette of a Mustang with a white blaze. The caps had become unexpectedly popular in town, with locals and visitors alike purchasing them to show support for the conservation effort. Outside, Maya started the engine of the initiative's all-terrain vehicle, giving it a few minutes to warm up while Emily loaded their equipment, binoculars, cameras, data tablets, and thermoses of hot coffee. The observation point was only 4 miles away, but the snow-covered terrain required careful navigation. As they drove through the winter landscape, Maya reflected on the dramatic changes in her life since that fateful day when Spirit had appeared. On Pine Creek Road, after much consideration, she had taken a 1-year leave of absence from the sheriff's department to join James's research team full-time. The arrangement gave her time to determine if this new path was truly her calling, while keeping the option to return to law enforcement if she chose. So far, she had no regrets. Working with the Mustangs, documenting their behaviors and helping to secure their protection had awakened something in her that she hadn't realized was missing. The research combined her skills of observation and record-keeping with a new sense of purpose that felt increasingly right. They found James already at the observation point, a low wooden structure designed to blend with the landscape while providing shelter from the elements. Large windows offered clear views of the winter grazing area below, where the Mustang herd could be seen moving deliberately through the snow, searching for patches of exposed grass. Right on time, James greeted them, his face ruddy from the cold despite the shelter. His broken leg had healed well, though he still used a walking stick on uneven terrain. They've been quite active this morning. Maya unpacked her equipment, while Emily prepared coffee. After 6 months of working together, they had developed an easy rhythm, each understanding their role in the observation process. James focused on behavioral analysis, Emily on data organization, and Maya on photographic documentation and field notes. Has Spirit made an appearance? Maya asked, adjusting her camera's settings for the bright, snowy conditions. James nodded, toward the far edge of the herd. About an hour ago. She's been doing her usual boundary walks, checking the perimeter before rejoining the main group. Through her camera's telephoto lens, Maya located the chestnut mare with the distinctive white blaze. Spirit had become the primary focus of their research, not only because of her extraordinary behaviors, but because understanding her could potentially provide insights into Mustang cognition and adaptation more broadly. Over the past months, they had documented patterns that expanded on James's earlier observations. Spirit maintained her regular visits to Michael's gravesite, even in winter, when the journey required navigating through deep snow. She continued to show unusual awareness of human activity, particularly when uniformed visitors came to the research center. And most significantly, she had begun what James termed mediating behaviors. Actions that seemed to facilitate interactions between the herd and human observers in ways that defied conventional wildlife behavior patterns. I've been thinking about Torres's suggestion, James said as they settled into their observation routine, about the educational component of the initiative. Congressman Torres had become a staunch advocate for the research program, visiting whenever his schedule permitted and helping to secure additional resources. His most recent proposal involved developing educational programs that would bring students to the research center to learn about Mustang behavior and conservation. It's a good idea, Maya replied, capturing a series of images as Spirit moved gracefully through the snow. But I know you're concerned about too much human presence. Disrupting the herd. James nodded thoughtfully. That's the balance we need to find. Education is essential for long-term conservation, but it can't come at the expense of the Mustang's well-being. As they discussed potential approaches to educational programming, Maya's camera captured a sudden shift in the herd's behavior. Several horses raised their heads alertly, looking toward the northwest boundary. Spirit, who had been grazing peacefully, now stood tall, ears pricked forward in evident concern. Something's disturbing them, James said, raising his binoculars. Emily, can you check the property boundary map? Emily quickly pulled up the digital map on her tablet. That direction would be the Dixon Ranch border, about half a mile from their current position. Maya zoomed her camera in further, scanning the distant tree line. I see movement at the edge of those pines. Vehicles, I think. James's expression darkened. Sam Dixon mentioned something about clearing those old growth pines for new grazing areas at the town council meeting last week. I didn't realize he was planning to start so soon. The sound of machinery became audible even at their distance, the rumble of engines and the distinctive whine of chainsaws. The Mustang herd grew increasingly agitated, with several younger horses beginning to move restlessly, while the lead mare attempted to maintain order. This is concerning, James said, making rapid notes in his journal. That area isn't just adjacent to our protected land. It contains the natural springs the herd relies on during dry periods. If Dixon clears those trees, the water flow patterns could be significantly altered. Maya continued documenting the herd's response, noting with particular interest Spirit's behavior. Unlike the other Mustangs, who were showing signs of wanting to retreat from the disturbance, Spirit had moved to the edge of the herd closest to the noise, her stance watchful rather than fearful. She's not running, Maya observed. She's assessing. Through her lens, Maya watched as Spirit seemed to make a decision. The mare turned and trotted purposefully toward the lead mare, moved around her in what appeared to be a deliberate pattern, then broke away from the herd entirely, heading directly toward the research center's main building. This is remarkable, James breathed, watching through his binoculars. She's deliberately moving toward human territory rather than away from the disturbance. Emily looked up from her tablet with concern. Should we follow her, see what she's doing? James considered for a moment, then nodded. Maya, you and I will follow at a distance. Emily, stay here and continue recording the main herd's behavior. They quickly gathered essential equipment and returned to the ATV. Maya drove carefully, maintaining enough distance not to influence Spirit's movements while keeping the mare in sight. The Mustang moved with clear purpose, following what they now knew was one of her regular paths toward the research center. She's heading directly for the cabin, James noted as they crested a small rise and saw Spirit picking her way through the snow ahead of them, her chestnut coat vivid against the white landscape. When they reached the research center, they found an unexpected sight. Spirit stood near Michael's grave on the hill behind the cabin, but she wasn't alone. Congressman Torres's vehicle was parked in the driveway, and Torres himself stood on the porch, clearly surprised by the appearance of the wild Mustang. As James and Maya approached, Torres waved in greeting. "I was planning to surprise you," he called, "but it seems I'm the one who got surprised instead." Spirit watched their arrival with alert interest, but made no move to flee. She remained near the grave marker, occasionally pawing at the snow-covered ground, as if drawing attention to her presence. "How long has she been here?" James asked, as they joined Torres on the porch. "About 10 minutes, Torres replied. "I had just arrived when I spotted her coming up the hill. Extraordinary to see her approach so directly." Maya explained the situation with the Dixon Ranch clearing operation and the herd's disturbed behavior. Torres' expression grew concerned as he listened. "That's troubling," he said. "The conservation designation protects the heritage area itself, but we have limited authority over adjacent private lands, unless they can be shown to directly impact protected resources." "Like the springs," James added. "If Dixon's clearing affects water flow into the heritage area, that could provide grounds for review." As they discussed potential responses to the situation, Maya kept her attention on Spirit, who continued her unusual behavior, moving between the gravesite and a position where she was clearly visible to the humans, as if trying to maintain their focus. "She's trying to tell us something," Maya said suddenly, interrupting the policy discussion. "Just like when she led me to James in the forest. She's not just reacting to the disturbance, she's deliberately seeking intervention." Torres looked skeptical but intrigued. "You believe she's asking for help with the Dixon situation?" "I know how it sounds," Maya acknowledged. "But after everything we've documented about her behavior, I don't think it's an unreasonable interpretation." James nodded slowly. Maya could be right. Spirit has demonstrated an understanding of human assistance before. She may be making connections we wouldn't expect from a wild animal. Torres studied Spirit thoughtfully. "If you're right, that would be, well, beyond remarkable. It would suggest a level of cognitive processing that challenges our fundamental understanding of animal intelligence." As they watched, Spirit tossed her head and began moving down the hill away from the grave, stopping to look back at them expectantly. The same behavior she had exhibited when leading Maya to James months earlier. "I think she wants us to follow," Maya said, already moving toward the ATV. "Wait," Torres cautioned. "If she's leading us toward the Dixon property, we need to be careful. Trespassing could undermine our legal position if this becomes a dispute." James considered this, then suggested a compromise. "We'll follow at a distance, staying within the heritage area boundaries. If she's trying to show us something affecting the protected land, we need to document it properly." With Torres joining them, they followed Spirit's deliberate path through the snow-covered landscape. The mare maintained a steady pace, occasionally pausing to ensure they were still following but never allowing them to get too close. Maintaining the wild Mustangs, natural caution around humans. After about 20 minutes, they approached the northwest boundary of the protected area. The sounds of machinery had grown louder, and through the trees, they could see several large vehicles and a work crew actively cutting down the old growth pines that marked the property line. Spirit stopped at the very edge of the heritage area, looking pointedly toward where a small stream crossed from the Dixon property into the protected land. Even from their position, Maya could see that the clearing operation had already affected the waterway. Fallen trees and disturbed earth had partially dammed the flow, diverting water away from its natural course. That's one of the tributary springs that feeds the main watering area for the herd, James said with growing alarm. If they continue clearing like this, they could permanently alter the hydrology of the entire western section. Torres pulled out his phone, taking photographs of the disruption while staying carefully on the heritage area side of the boundary. This gives us grounds for an immediate cease and desist, he said, his political instincts engaging. Water resources crossing property boundaries are subject to different regulations than the land itself. As they documented the situation, Spirit remained nearby, her behavior a remarkable combination of wild caution and deliberate communication. She had successfully led them to a threat to her herd's welfare, one that might have gone unnoticed, until far more damage had been done if not for her intervention. I've contacted the regional BLM office, Torres said after making several calls. They're sending an environmental compliance officer immediately. Dixon failed to file the proper watershed impact statements before beginning this operation. Maya found herself overwhelmed with emotion as she watched Spirit standing proudly at the boundary of her territory, having once again bridged the gap between the wild and human worlds to protect those under her care. The Mustang's intelligence and determination challenged every conventional understanding of wild animal behavior. You know what this means for our research, James said quietly, standing beside Maya as they observed the remarkable mare. If we can document that she not only recognizes threats to the herd, but deliberately seeks human intervention to address them, that's a cognitive leap that revolutionizes how we understand interspecies communication. Maya nodded, tears forming in her eyes despite the cold. What had begun as a strange encounter on a Montana highway had led her to witness something truly extraordinary. A wild Mustang who had learned through her connection with a compassionate veteran that humans and wild animals could help each other if only they found ways to communicate across the boundaries that typically divided them. As the winter sun began its early descent toward the mountains, casting long blue shadows across the snow, Spirit tossed her head one final time and turned away, trotting purposefully back toward where her herd waited. She had done what she came to do, bridged two worlds to protect her family, just as Michael Ramirez had once bridged those same worlds to save her. Maya watched her go, knowing with absolute certainty that her decision to join this research initiative had been the right one. There were stories in the wild worth telling, connections worth protecting, and lessons about compassion and intelligence that transcended the boundaries between species. Thanks to one remarkable Mustang, those stories would now be told, those connections preserved, and those lessons learned by generations to come. Inspiring piano and string swell. Spring arrived in Pine Ridge County with an explosion of wildflowers and new growth. The snow retreated to the highest peaks, leaving behind vibrant meadows and crystal-clear streams. As the landscape transformed, so too did the Ramirez Mustang Research Initiative, evolving from a small operation into a respected conservation and research center. Maya stood at the edge of the newly constructed observation deck, watching as a group of university students listened attentively to James's lecture about Mustang social structures. The educational component of their program had taken shape carefully over the winter months, designed to balance human presence with the herd's well-being. Small groups visited on a limited schedule, strictly following protocols that minimized disruption to the Mustang's natural behaviors. And what makes this particular herd so unique, James was saying, gesturing toward the valley where several Mustangs grazed peacefully, is not just their behaviors, but the documented instances of what we call cross-species communication initiatives. Cases where Mustangs, particularly the mare we've named Spirit, have deliberately sought human intervention. A young woman raised her hand. Is it true that she led a police officer to you when you were injured? That sounds more like something a trained animal would do, not a wild horse. James smiled. That officer is actually here with us today. Maya, would you mind sharing your experience with the students? Maya joined the group, still feeling a flutter of self-consciousness when speaking to audiences, despite the months of practice. What I witnessed that day challenged everything I thought I knew about wild animals, she began, recounting the extraordinary sequence of events that had brought her into the forest to find James. The students listened with rapt attention, their initial skepticism gradually giving way to wonder as Maya described Spirit's deliberate behavior and the subsequent discoveries about her connection to Michael Ramirez. So she recognized your uniform as something similar to what the veteran wore. One student asked. That's our working theory, Maya confirmed. Through her early interactions with Michael, Spirit developed an association between uniforms and human assistance. When she found James injured, she sought out someone in a uniform who might help. And you've documented other instances of this. Behavior? Another student inquired. James nodded, pulling up images on his tablet. The most significant was the Dixon Creek incident 4 months ago, when Spirit deliberately led us to a water source that was being damaged by neighboring land. Clearing. Her intervention allowed us to secure an environmental protection order before permanent harm was done to the watershed. As the educational session concluded, Maya noticed a familiar vehicle coming up the long driveway to the research center. Congressman Torres had become a regular visitor, his initial political interest evolving into genuine passion for the project. Today, however, he wasn't alone. A silver SUV followed behind his, carrying what appeared to be a film crew. I think our documentary team has arrived, James said, joining Maya as the students dispersed for their field observation exercise. The documentary had been Torres's idea, a way to share Spirit's remarkable story with a broader audience while highlighting the importance of wild Mustang conservation. After careful consideration, they had agreed to allow a small, experienced wildlife film crew to document the research initiative and the Mustang herd, under strict guidelines to ensure minimal disruption. Torres greeted them warmly as he approached. Perfect timing. The crew just arrived from New York last night. They're eager to get started while the spring light is so beautiful. Introductions were made as the film team unloaded their equipment. The director, Claire Winters, was a respected wildlife documentarian with a reputation for ethical filming practices and compelling storytelling. Her team consisted of just 3 other members, a cinematographer, a sound engineer, and a field producer, keeping the human footprint as small as possible. Thank you for allowing us this opportunity, Claire said, shaking hands with James. And Maya, what you're documenting here is extraordinary, and we want to help tell this story with the respect and accuracy it deserves. Over coffee in the research center's main room, they reviewed the filming protocols that had been established to protect the Mustangs. The crew would use long-range equipment whenever possible, maintain minimum distances from the herd, and follow all guidance from the research team regarding their movements and timing. Our primary concern is Spirit, James explained. She's shown remarkable comfort with human presence, but she remains a wild animal, Any signs of stress or changed behavior? And will need to adjust immediately. Claire nodded her understanding. Absolutely. We've worked with sensitive wildlife before, and we always prioritize their welfare over getting footage. Do you have a sense of when we might be able to observe Spirit? I understand her appearances can be unpredictable. They're not entirely unpredictable, Maya clarified. She has patterns, though they're complex. She typically visits Michael's grave every 10 to 14 days, more frequently during transitions between seasons. And she often appears when new uniformed personnel arrive at the center. This last observation had been documented multiple times over the past months, when rangers, conservation officers, or military veterans in uniform visited the research center. Spirit seemed more likely to make an appearance, sometimes approaching closer than she did with civilian visitors. Speaking of which, Torres interjected, I brought something I thought might interest you both. He retrieved a folder from his briefcase and handed it to James. The Veterans Affairs Committee has reviewed your proposal. They're prepared to fund a pilot program. James opened the folder eagerly, with Maya looking over his shoulder. Inside was approval documentation for what they had been calling the Mustang Mediation Project, a therapeutic initiative that would bring veterans suffering from PTSD to the Research Center for Structured Interaction with the Environment and Controlled Observation of the Mustang Herd. This is wonderful news, James said, emotion evident in his voice. Michael would have been so pleased to see his connection with Spirit helping other veterans. The committee was particularly moved by the documentation of Spirit's continued visits to Michael's grave, Torres explained. Many of them are veterans themselves, and they understood immediately the symbolic power of that connection. As they discussed implementation details for the new program, Maya noticed Claire's cinematographer setting up near the large window that overlooked the valley. He adjusted his camera, then gestured urgently to Claire. I think you all might want to see this, he said quietly. They moved to the window, following his gaze to the hillside where Michael's grave stood beneath the ancient pine. A familiar chestnut figure with a white blaze was making her way deliberately up the slope, Spirit making one of her regular visits to the grave site. Extraordinary timing, Claire whispered, clearly moved by the sight. May I begin filming? James nodded, and the crew quickly but quietly set up their equipment at a respectful distance. Through the powerful zoom lens, they captured remarkable footage as Spirit approached the grave marker and the weathered uniform jacket that still hung on its post. The Mustang circled the site once, then stood quietly beside the marker, her head lowered slightly as if in contemplation. She's been doing this for nearly 4 years now, Maya explained softly to Claire. Since Michael's passing, we've documented over 200 separate visits. After several minutes, Spirit raised her head and looked directly toward the research center windows where they stood watching. Despite the distance, there was an uncanny sense of awareness in her gaze, an acknowledgement of their presence that sent shivers down Maya's spine even after months of observing this behavior. It's as if she knows we're talking about Michael and the Veterans Program, Torres murmured. The documentary team continued filming as Spirit eventually turned and made her way back down the hill, moving with unhurried grace through the spring. Flowers. Instead of returning immediately to the main herd, however, she did something unexpected. She began walking directly toward the research center. This is unusual, James said, making quick notes on his tablet. She rarely approaches the building this directly, unless there's a specific stimulus. They watched in amazement as Spirit continued her approach, eventually stopping about 50 yards from the building. Her posture was relaxed and curious rather than fearful or agitated. There's someone in uniform she hasn't seen before, Maya realized, nodding toward Torres's assistant, who had remained in the background during their meeting. The young man wore a military service pin on his lapel, and his posture suggested military training. Torres confirmed Maya's observation. Ryan served 2 tours in Afghanistan. He just joined my staff last month. Claire gestured to her cinematographer to continue filming while maintaining absolute stillness. They were witnessing one of the behaviors that made Spirit so remarkable. Her apparent recognition of and interest in military-connected humans, even those she had never encountered before. After several minutes of this quiet observation, Spirit nickered softly and turned, trotting away toward where the main herd grazed in the distance. The moment she was gone, Claire's team erupted in quiet excitement. "That was incredible," the director breathed. "The way she approached, how deliberately she moved. If I hadn't seen it myself, I'm not sure I would have believed it." "That's precisely why we wanted to document her behavior properly," James explained. "What Spirit demonstrates challenges conventional understanding of wild animal cognition and memory. She's maintained not just a connection to her rescuer, but an apparent understanding of his social group, humans in uniform, that has persisted for years after his passing." As the documentary team reviewed their footage, Maya stepped outside, onto the deck, scanning the valley where Spirit had now rejoined her herd. The spring breeze carried the scent of wildflowers and new growth, a tangible reminder of renewal and possibility. Torres joined her, his expression thoughtful. "You know, when I first got involved with this project, I saw it primarily as a unique conservation opportunity, something that might distinguish my work on the Natural Resources Committee." Maya nodded, understanding the political reality that often drove initial support for such initiatives. "But it's become something much more personal," Torres continued. "Seeing Spirit's ongoing connection to Michael, watching how she bridges these worlds, it's changed how I think about our relationship with the natural world." "It's had the same effect on me," Maya admitted. "When I first encountered Spirit on that highway, I was just doing my job, responding to a traffic disruption. I could never have imagined where that moment would lead." Inside, the team was reviewing the filming, schedule for the coming weeks, plotting how to capture the herd's behaviors through the changing seasons. The documentary would follow the Mustangs for a full year, documenting not only Spirit's extraordinary behaviors, but the implementation of the Veterans Program and the ongoing conservation efforts. "There's something I've been meaning to ask you," Torres said, turning to face Maya directly. "The sheriff mentioned that your leave of absence is coming up for renewal next month. Have you decided what you're going to do?" Maya smiled, realizing the decision had actually been made in her heart months ago. "I'm staying with the initiative. The sheriff and I have worked out a special liaison position. I'll maintain my law enforcement credentials but be assigned primarily to wildlife protection and conservation education." Torres nodded approvingly. "I think that's where you belong now. Some people spend their whole lives looking for their true calling. You had the courage to recognize yours when it quite literally chased you down on a highway." Maya laughed at his phrasing, but recognized the truth in his words. Her encounter with Spirit had changed the trajectory of her life in ways she could never have anticipated. From law enforcement officer to wildlife researcher and conservation advocate, a journey as unexpected as it was fulfilling. As the afternoon sun cast long shadows across the valley, the research center filled with purpose and activity. The documentary team established their equipment, the student group returned from their field observations, and Emily arrived with updated tracking data on the herd's spring movements. In the midst of this productive energy, Maya felt a profound sense of rightness, that all of them, in their various roles, were part of something truly meaningful. Later, as twilight settled over the mountains, Maya took a few moments alone to visit Michael's grave. The path had become familiar over the months, each step a reminder of the extraordinary chain of connections that had brought her here. At the gravesite, she straightened the weathered uniform jacket on its post, a gesture of respect for the man whose compassion had created such an enduring legacy. From this vantage point, she could see the Mustang herd in the distance, small, dark figures moving gracefully against the backdrop of the awakening spring landscape. Somewhere among them was Spirit, the remarkable mare who had defied expectations, transcended boundaries, and in doing so, changed many lives, including Maya's own. As she turned to head back to the center, Maya caught a glimpse of movement along the ridge, a solitary figure silhouetted against the darkening sky. Even at this distance, the distinctive profile was unmistakable. Spirit stood watching, a sentinel between worlds, before disappearing into the gathering dusk. Soft, emotional, music builds. 1 year had passed since the documentary team first arrived at the Ramirez Mustang Research Initiative. The changing seasons had brought growth and transformation, not just to the landscape, but to the project itself. What had begun as a small research operation had blossomed into a multifaceted conservation and education center that drew visitors and researchers from across the country. Maya stood at the edge of the newly expanded observation area, watching as the first group of veterans participating in the Mustang mediation program made their way carefully across the meadow. The program had moved from concept to reality over the past 6 months, carefully designed to provide therapeutic experiences for veterans struggling with PTSD while respecting the wild nature of the Mustang herd. Dr. Elaine Winters, a renowned therapeutic specialist who had joined the initiative's team, walked beside the veterans, her voice carrying faintly to where Maya stood. Remember what we discussed about body language and energy. These animals are highly sensitive to both. Remain calm, move slowly, and allow them to determine the level of interaction. The 6 veterans, 3 women and 3 men representing different branches of service and conflicts, moved with deliberate awareness, following the guidance they'd received during their orientation. None of them approached the Mustangs directly. Instead, they settled at comfortable distances on the special seating areas that had been strategically placed around the meadow, allowing for observation without intrusion. James joined Maya at the observation point, leaning lightly on his walking stick. Though his leg had healed well, he still used the stick during field work as a precaution. "How are they doing?" he asked quietly. "Remarkably well," Maya replied. "Dr. Winters says their response to the program has exceeded expectations. Even those who were most skeptical initially have reported significant moments of connection and peace." The Mustang mediation program had been carefully structured around passive observation rather than direct interaction with the horses. Veterans spent time in the Mustang's environment, observing their natural behaviors and social structures while engaging in guided reflection exercises. The approach honored both the wild nature of the horses and the healing journey of the veterans. "Any sign of spirit today?" James asked, scanning the meadow where several Mustangs grazed peacefully, maintaining a comfortable distance from the human visitors. Maya shook her head. "Not yet, though based on her patterns I wouldn't be surprised if she makes an appearance. It's been 12 days since her last visit to Michael's grave, and we have a new group of uniformed participants." As if summoned by their conversation, a movement at the eastern edge of the meadow caught Maya's attention. A chestnut mare with a distinctive white blaze emerged from the tree line, her movements purposeful yet relaxed as she surveyed the scene before her. "There she is," Maya said softly, pointing out Spirit's approach to James. They watched as the mare assessed the new human presences in her territory, her intelligent eyes seeming to take in every detail. What happened next had been documented multiple times over the past year, but still filled Maya with wonder each time she witnessed it. Instead of avoiding the human visitors as most wild Mustangs would, Spirit began a careful, deliberate approach. She moved first toward one veteran who sat quietly on a boulder at the meadow's edge, a former Army medic who wore a service pin on his jacket. The veteran remained perfectly still, following the protocols they had been taught, as Spirit approached to within about 30 feet. There she paused, regarding him with evident interest before moving on to observe each of the other veterans in turn. Her behavior was neither that of a domesticated horse seeking interaction, nor a wild animal avoiding humans, but something uniquely her own, a careful assessment that acknowledged the human presence while maintaining appropriate wild boundaries. "She's checking each of them," James murmured, making notes on his tablet, particularly those with visible service indicators. Dr. Winters had made her way back to the observation area, watching Spirit's behavior with professional interest. "The impact on the veterans is profound," she said quietly. "Even those who were skeptical about the special Mustang story. There's something about being seen and acknowledged by a wild animal that speaks to them on a deep level." Maya understood that connection intimately. Her own first encounter with Spirit had changed the course of her life, opening her to possibilities she had never imagined. Over the past year, she had witnessed similar transformative moments for many others who encountered the remarkable mare. As they observed, Spirit completed her circuit of the veterans, and then, to everyone's surprise, began moving deliberately toward Michael's gravesite on the hill above the meadow. This was unusual. She typically visited the grave early in the morning or at dusk, rarely during midday when human activity was highest. "Should we let the veterans see this?" Dr. Winters asked. "It's not part of today's scheduled activities, but I think they should witness it," James decided. "It's central to understanding Spirit's story and what makes this program unique." Dr. Winters nodded and returned to the group, quietly explaining what was happening and inviting them to observe from a respectful distance. The veterans gathered their things and followed her to a vantage point where they could see the gravesite without disturbing Spirit's ritual. Maya and James joined them, maintaining a respectful silence as Spirit made her way up the familiar path to where Michael Ramirez had been laid to rest 5 years earlier. The worn uniform jacket still hung on its post beside the grave marker, faded by sun and weather, but carefully preserved by the research team who understood its significance. Spirit approached the grave with the same deliberate awareness she had, shown hundreds of times before in their documentation. She circled the site once, then stood beside the marker, her head lowered slightly. After several minutes of this quiet vigil, she moved closer to the uniform jacket, gently touching it with her muzzle in what appeared to be a gesture of recognition or acknowledgement. Together, they found James in his office, reviewing data from the day's observations. His face lit up at the sight of Torres, rising to shake his hand warmly. "David, we weren't expecting you until next week's board meeting." "This couldn't wait," Torres replied, placing a folder on James's desk. "The heritage area expansion was approved this morning. The final paperwork came through an hour ago." Maya felt a surge of elation. They had been working for months to secure additional protected territory for the Mustang herd, particularly the winter grazing lands that lay just outside the original boundaries. The expansion would ensure the herd's long-term security, providing them with continuous protected habitat through all seasonal migrations. "That's wonderful news," James said, quickly scanning the documents. "And the water rights provisions?" Torres nodded. "Included exactly as we proposed. The springs and watersheds are protected with specific language preventing adjacent development that could impact water flow or quality. This was particularly significant given their ongoing challenges with neighboring landowners like Sam Dixon, whose initial attempt to clear the watershed area had been halted, but who continued to seek ways to develop his property regardless of potential impacts on the heritage area. "There's more," Torres continued. "The Veterans Affairs Committee has approved full funding for the Mustang mediation program for the next 5 years. They were particularly impressed with the preliminary data Dr. Winters presented last month. The program's early results had indeed been promising. Veterans participating in the structured observation and reflection activities showed measurable improvements in stress indicators, sleep quality, and social connection metrics. Dr. Winters was careful not to overstate the findings, emphasizing that the approach complemented rather than replaced traditional PTSD treatments, but the positive impacts were undeniable. "This calls for a celebration," James declared. "Let's join the veterans for dinner and share the good news." As they made their way to the dining hall, Maya reflected on how far they had come since that fateful day when Spirit had appeared on Pine Creek Road, determinedly seeking help for an injured man. What had seemed like an isolated incident of extraordinary animal behavior had blossomed into something far more significant. A research initiative that was changing understanding of animal cognition, a conservation project that protected thousands of acres of critical habitat, and a healing program that offered new perspectives to veterans struggling with the invisible wounds of war. Through it all, Spirit remained wild and free, moving with her herd through the protected landscape, occasionally choosing to interact with humans on her own terms, and faithfully maintaining her connection to Michael Ramirez through her regular visits to his grave. She had become both symbol and teacher, a reminder that the boundaries between species, between wild and domestic, between memory and present awareness, were far more permeable than humans had traditionally believed. As they entered the dining hall, where the veterans were sharing their experiences from the day, Maya caught sight of a photograph on the wall, one she had taken herself nearly a year earlier. It showed Spirit standing on the ridge at sunset, her chestnut coat gilded by the fading light, her posture alert and dignified against the vast Montana sky. Beneath the image was a simple quote from Michael's journal, found after his death. "Cheese, while remembers what we forget, that connection is not possession, that love transcends understanding, that some bonds need no explanation." Those words had become something of a motto for the initiative, capturing the essence of what they were working to protect and understand. Maya paused before the photograph, offering a silent moment of gratitude for the extraordinary Mustang who had chased after her patrol car that day, who had led her into the forest to find James, and who had ultimately led her to discover a purpose and passion she had never anticipated. Outside, as night settled over the valley, Spirit and her herd moved beneath the stars, wild and free on protected land, their future secure thanks to one remarkable mare's ability to bridge worlds and the humans who had learned to listen to what she had to teach. As the years passed, the legend of Spirit grew. Thousands visited the Ramirez Mustang Heritage Area, learning about the extraordinary mare who bridged two worlds. Maya never returned to her old life, finding her true calling in protecting the herd and sharing their story. On the 5th anniversary of the research initiative, as Maya stood watching the sunset from Michael's grave, she spotted a familiar figure on the distant ridge. Spirit, with a chestnut foal bearing the same distinctive white blaze. The sight brought tears to her eyes. The legacy would continue. The connection remained unbroken. From one unexpected encounter on a highway to a movement that transformed conservation, research, and healing, Spirit had proven that some bonds transcend all boundaries. Music intensifies. If this story touched your heart, please like and subscribe to our channel for more extraordinary tales of connection between humans and animals that remind us of the wonder that surrounds us every day. Maya glanced at the veterans watching this display. Several had tears streaming silently down their faces. One woman, a former Marine, whispered something to Dr. Winters, who nodded encouragingly. After Spirit had completed her ritual and moved away from the grave, making her way back down toward the main herd, Dr. Winters gathered the veterans for a reflection circle at a nearby seating area. Maya and James remained at a discreet distance, allowing the group their privacy while remaining available if needed. Later, as the sun began its descent toward the western mountains, the veterans prepared to return to the main research center for their evening session. One of them, the former Marine who had whispered to Dr. Winters earlier, approached Maya and James. "I wanted to thank you both," she said, her voice steady despite the emotion evident in her eyes. "When I signed up for this program, I was skeptical, another well-meaning attempt to fix what combat broke in us. But today..." She paused, gathering her thoughts. Watching that Mustang visit the grave, seeing how she's maintained that connection across years, across species boundaries, it spoke to something I've been struggling with since my last deployment. Maya waited, sensing there was more the veteran wanted to share. "We talk a lot about bonds in the service," she continued. "The connections that form in combat, the loyalty that transcends normal relationships. But we don't have good language for what happens to those bonds when they're broken by death or distance." Watching Spirit today, her faithfulness to that connection with Michael, it gives me a new way to think about the comrades I've lost. That those bonds remain meaningful even when they can't be physically maintained. James nodded, understanding. In his eyes, Michael believed that too. In his final journals, he wrote about how Spirit taught him that connections transcend our usual categories and limitations. The veteran smiled slightly. Well, she's still teaching that lesson, and some of us really needed to learn it. As the group made their way back to the center, Maya remained behind for a few moments, watching the Mustang herd grazing peacefully in the golden evening light. The documentary about Spirit and the research initiative had premiered 3 months earlier to critical acclaim, bringing international attention to their work. Donations and support had flowed in, allowing them to expand their conservation efforts and educational programs. Yet amid the growth and recognition, they had remained true to their core mission, protecting the Mustang's freedom and natural behaviors while documenting Spirit's extraordinary legacy. The balance wasn't always easy to maintain. There had been pressure from various quarters to capitalize more aggressively on Spirit's fame, to create more accessible tourist experiences, or even attempts to capture and domesticate her for closer study. They had resisted all such suggestions, understanding that Spirit's significance lay precisely in her wild nature, in her choice to bridge worlds on her own terms. The research initiative existed not to control or change her, but to learn from and document the remarkable connection she had forged. Maya made her way to the gravesite, taking a moment to straighten the uniform jacket as she did each evening. The simple ritual had become part of her own connection to this story, her acknowledgement of Michael Ramirez, whose compassion toward an orphaned foal had created ripples that continued to transform lives. As she turned to head back to the center, she spotted Congressman Torres's vehicle coming up the long driveway. He had remained a steadfast supporter of the initiative, using his position to secure continued funding and protection for the Mustang herd. His visits were less frequent now that the program was established, but always welcome. Perfect timing. Maya greeted him as he parked near the main building. The first veteran group just completed their field session. They're having dinner now if you'd like to join them. Torres smiled warmly. I'd like that. But first, I have news to share with you and James. Is he inside?